The morning of March 6, 1944, over the North Sea, Captain Don Gentile banks his P-51 Mustang into formation, 268 miles from his base in England. Around him, the sky fills with the geometric precision of bomber formations, 660 B-17 seconds arranged in staggered combat boxes, their contrails writing temporary mathematics across the frozen air. But Gentile's attention fixes on something else. His fuel gauge. He's already burned through a third of his tanks, and they haven't even crossed into German airspace. In any other fighter, the Thunderbolt, the Lightning, even the vaunted Spitfire, this would be the moment to turn back. But Gentile keeps flying east. Because 5 years earlier, in a drafty hangar in Inglewood, California, a Dutch immigrant engineer named Edgar Schmood had made a decision that every expert told him was ridiculous. He had designed a fighter wing based on a theory that didn't work. Airfoil smooth, mathematically precise, theoretically capable of reducing drag by 40%, had been tested in wind tunnels by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics since 1935. On paper, it was beautiful. In practice, it was a disaster. Every attempt to build a full-scale aircraft around laminar-flow principles had failed. The slightest surface imperfection, a rivet head, a paint run, even the residue from a mechanic's fingerprint could trip the smooth airflow into turbulence, destroying the theoretical advantage. The British had tried it. The Germans had considered and rejected it. By 1939, laminar flow was considered interesting mathematics, with no practical application to combat aircraft. Edgar Schmood had bet everything that they were wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Schmood arrived at North American Aviation in 1936, carrying drafting tools and an accent that marked him as permanently foreign in Southern California's aircraft industry. Born in Germany, trained in Brazil, he had spent the 1920s designing Fokker transports in the Netherlands before the Depression scattered engineers across continents like seeds. At North American, he found himself working on trainers the AT-6 Texan, dependable and utterly unglamorous. But Schmood read everything: NACA technical reports, German aeronautical journals, British Air Ministry specifications. And in 1939, he read something that changed the trajectory of the air war. The British Purchasing Commission needed a fighter. Desperately. The specification landed on the desk of North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, in April of 1940. Britain was already at war. France was collapsing. The Royal Air Force needed fighters in quantities that Supermarine and Hawker couldn't possibly deliver. The Commission wanted North American to build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license, a proven design, already in production, adequate if not exceptional. Kindleberger looked at the specification and made a counter-proposal that stunned the British mission. North American would design and build a completely new fighter, superior to anything currently flying, and deliver the prototype in 120 days. The British thought he was insane, so did most of his own engineers. But Kindleberger had Schmood. Schmood had been thinking about laminar flow for 3 years. The NACA reports described it in the language of fluid dynamics, boundary layer transition, pressure gradients, Reynolds numbers. But the core concept was almost absurdly simple. Air flowing over a conventional wing creates turbulence, tiny, chaotic eddies that steal energy and create drag. A laminar flow airfoil, shaped with mathematical precision, could theoretically maintain smooth, layered airflow far back along the wing surface. Less turbulence meant less drag. Less drag meant less fuel burned for every mile travelled. And less fuel burned meant possibly, theoretically, if the mathematics worked in reality as they did on paper, a fighter that could fly twice as far as anything else in the sky. The risk was total. North American Aviation had never designed a fighter aircraft. The company's experience consisted of trainers and the occasional medium bomber. They had no wind tunnel of their own, no combat data, no margin for error. Schmood was proposing to stake the entire design on an aerodynamic theory that had never successfully transitioned from laboratory to combat. Kindleberger gave him the authorization on May 8, 1940, 117 days to the first flight. Schmude assembled a team in a corner of the Inglewood plant, 26 engineers working 18-hour shifts under blackout curtains as the war in Europe accelerated toward catastrophe. The design that emerged from those 4 months defied conventional fighter aesthetics. Where the Spitfire curved and the Messerschmitt angled, Schmude's fighter maintained an almost unnatural smoothness. The wing's cross-section followed NACA's 66 series laminar-flow profile, with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The fuselage, instead of the traditional fabric-over-frame construction, used flush-riveted aluminum panels that created an unbroken surface from spinner to tail. Even the landing gear retracted completely, leaving nothing to disturb the airflow. It looked fast, standing still. But looking fast and being fast were different propositions entirely. The prototype, designated NA-73X, rolled out of the hangar on September 9, 1940, 102 days after authorization, 15 days ahead of Kindleberger's impossible schedule. Test pilot Vance Breeze lifted it off Mines Field on October 26, and for 11 minutes, Schmude's theory confronted reality at 380 miles per hour. The aircraft flew. More than that, it flew smoothly, responding to controls with a precision that surprised Breeze. But the real test wouldn't come from handling characteristics. It would come from a fuel gauge and a stopwatch. North American's performance predictions, based entirely on calculated laminar flow benefits, promised a combat radius exceeding 750 miles with external tanks. The Spitfire Mark V, at that moment defending Britain, had a combat radius of approximately 175 miles. The Messerschmitt Bf-109E that had battled over southern England during the summer managed roughly 400 miles. Schmude's numbers seemed hallucinatory too good by half, the kind of optimistic mathematics that characterized every failed aircraft program. Except the numbers held. Early flight tests confirmed drag figures 30% below comparable fighters. The wing was working. Not perfectly surface imperfections still caused localized turbulence, but well enough to validate the core theory. An aircraft with equivalent power to a Spitfire was demonstrably faster and, critically, more efficient. But there was a problem that threatened to reduce the Mustang to an expensive curiosity: the Allison V1710 engine. Schmude had designed the airframe around the only American inline engine in production, the 12-cylinder Allison, that powered the P-40 and P-38. At altitudes below 15,000 feet, the Allison performed adequately. Above that threshold, it gasped. The single-stage supercharger couldn't compress enough air to maintain power, and the engine's performance fell off dramatically. By 20,000 feet, the altitude where bomber formations cruised, where the Luftwaffe interceptors climbed to attack the Mustang's speed advantage, evaporated. The British took delivery of the first production Mustangs in October 1941 and assigned them to Army Cooperation Command for low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack. The aircraft excelled in that role, using its speed and range to penetrate deep into occupied France. But as an air superiority fighter, as the weapon that might contest German control of the high-altitude battlespace over Europe, it was effectively useless. The irony was perfect and bitter. Schmude had solved the aerodynamic problem that everyone said couldn't be solved. He had created an airframe with unprecedented efficiency, and it didn't matter, because the only engine available choked in thin air. For 2 years, the Mustang remained an oddity admired by pilots who flew it, ignored by strategic planners who needed fighters that could escort bombers into Germany. And during those 2 years, the men of the 8th Air Force learned what happened when bombers flew without adequate fighter protection. The numbers told the story in stark arithmetic. On October 14, 1943, 291 B-17 seconds attacked ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, Germany. The P-47 Thunderbolts that escorted them reached the German border and turned back, their fuel exhausted. The bombers continued alone. German fighters Bf-109Gs and Fu-190 as that could climb to 30,000 feet and maintain combat power attacked in waves. 60 bombers didn't return. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. 600 men died or were captured. The mission achieved its objective. The ball-bearing plants burned, but the cost made deep penetration raids unsustainable. The 8th Air Force called it Black Thursday. Operational planners called it proof that unescorted daylight bombing was suicide. And in offices in Washington and London, strategists began seriously discussing abandoning the entire concept of precision daylight raids in favor of British-style night area bombing. The missing variable was range. The P-47, magnificent as a fighter, could escort bombers approximately 450 miles from base, barely to the German border. The P-38, with its twin engines, could reach 650 miles, but its performance above 25,000 feet was marginal, and it suffered mechanical issues in Europe's cold, damp climate. The Spitfire, already stretched thin defending Britain, lacked the fuel capacity for deep escort missions, even if enough could be spared. What was needed was a fighter that could fly 700, 800, even 1,000 miles from base, maintain combat effectiveness at 30,000 feet, and match or exceed the performance of the Luftwaffe's best interceptors. In November of 1943, that aircraft didn't exist. Except it did. It had existed since October of 1940. It just needed an engine that worked at altitude. The solution came from an unlikely source, a British test pilot named Ronald Harker, and a chance flight in April of 1942. Harker flew a Mustang I at the Royal Aircraft Establishment and immediately recognized what the airframe could become with proper power. He wrote a report recommending the installation of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the supercharged engine that powered the Spitfire and Lancaster bomber. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger maintained power to altitudes above 30,000 feet, exactly where the Allison failed. The British built 5 prototypes, designated Mustang X, with Merlin 61 engines in October 1942. The performance increase was staggering. Maximum speed jumped from 390 to 441 miles per hour. The service ceiling increased from 30,000 to 42,000 feet. And most critically, the Merlin's fuel efficiency at high altitude, combined with Schmood's laminar-flow wing, produced combat radius figures that seemed like typographical errors. With 2 108-gallon drop tanks, the Merlin-powered Mustang could fly 1,650 miles. Combat radius, the distance it could fly, fight for 15 minutes, and return exceeded 850 miles. North American received the contract for American Merlin production, built under license by Packard, in July of 1943. The designation changed to P-51B. The first production models reached England in December, and on March 6, 1944, they escorted bombers to Berlin for the first time in history, which returns us to Captain Don Gentile, 268 miles from base, watching his fuel gauge and continuing east. The bomber crews saw them first, the distinctive profile of Mustangs holding formation at 28,000 feet, still climbing. For 8 months, the men flying B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds had watched their escorts turn back somewhere over Belgium or the Netherlands, leaving them to face the Luftwaffe alone for the final 300 miles to target and 300 miles back. They had developed a bitter terminology for it. The moment when the P-47 seconds waggled their wings in farewell was called reaching the end of the string. Everything beyond that point was Indian country, where German fighters owned the sky. But on March 6th, the Mustangs didn't turn back. The tactical situation that morning illustrated the problem Schmood's wing had been designed to solve. Berlin sat 580 miles from the 8th Air Force bases in eastern England. A bomber, loaded with fuel and ordnance, cruised at approximately 180 miles per hour. The round trip required 6.5 hours of flight time. A fighter, burning fuel at combat power settings, protecting the bombers through climbs and turns, and the occasional burst of combat maneuvering, consumed gasoline at rates that made range calculations an exercise in grim mathematics. The P-47D Thunderbolt, with a 108-gallon drop tank, could reach approximately 475 miles from base before fuel reserves mandated return. That left more than 200 miles of the approach unprotected, the entire target area unprotected, and more than 200 miles of the return unprotected. The Luftwaffe, fighting over their own territory with extensive ground-based early warning networks, could choose their moment of attack with near certainty that no American fighters would interfere. The P-51B, theoretically, changed that calculation entirely, but theory and practice had diverged before. Major James Howard led the 354th Fighter Group that morning, the first unit to receive Mustangs in theater. His aircraft carried the standard load, internal fuel of 184 gallons, plus two 108-gallon drop tanks. Total, 400 gallons of gasoline to cover more than 1,000 miles of hostile airspace. The mathematics seemed absurd. The Merlin engine consumed approximately 70 gallons per hour at cruise settings, which should have exhausted the tanks long before reaching Berlin. But the laminar-flow wing changed the equation. At 28,000 feet, cruising at 310 miles per hour, Howard's Mustang achieved fuel consumption rates approximately 30% below conventional fighters of equivalent power. The smooth airflow over Schmood's precisely shaped wing reduced parasitic drag to levels that allowed the aircraft to fly farther on less fuel. It wasn't magic, it was physics, finally working in practice as it had on paper 5 years earlier. The formation crossed into German airspace at 9:47. No fighters rose to meet them. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to American escorts turning back at the border, was waiting deeper inland where the bombers would be alone. It was a reasonable tactical decision, based on 2 years of operational experience. But the operational experience had just become obsolete. At 10:31, approaching the target area, the first German fighters appeared, Bf 109Gs from Jagdgeschwader 3, climbing hard to intercept the bomber stream. They expected to find B-17 seconds defended only by their own guns, the standard situation since Black Thursday. Instead, they found Mustangs at altitude, maintaining formation, fuel reserves sufficient for sustained combat. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. Howard's after-action report, filed that evening at Boxted, documented 6 German fighters destroyed and 4 probables. The bomber formations lost 14 aircraft that day, a significant number, but less than a quarter of the losses from comparable unescorted missions. More importantly, every bomber that reached Berlin did so with American fighters overhead, and every bomber that left Berlin did so with American fighters providing cover. The Luftwaffe's tactical assumptions had been systematically invalidated, but the strategic implications took longer to crystallize. One mission proved possibility, not capability. The Mustang could reach Berlin, that was now demonstrated. Whether it could do so consistently, whether production could scale to provide adequate numbers, whether the maintenance burden of high-altitude operations would ground the fleet, all remained open questions. The answers came in the data accumulated over the following 3 months. By June of 1944, the 8th Air Force had transitioned most fighter groups to P-51 seconds. The operational statistics told a story that operational research teams initially struggled to believe. Average combat radius for P-51D Mustangs with drop tanks, 850 miles. Average combat radius for Bf 109G6, 320 miles. Average combat radius for Fubi 190A, 390 miles. The disparity wasn't merely significant, it was Mengde. A Luftwaffe fighter scrambling from an airfield in central Germany could intercept American bombers, engage perhaps 10 minutes, and had to break off to ensure sufficient fuel for landing. A Mustang flying from England could loiter over that same airfield for 30 minutes, engage German fighters as they took off or landed, and still retain adequate reserves for the return flight. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technological advantage manifested in operational flexibility that German tactical doctrine couldn't counter. By May of 1944, Mustang groups began flying fighter sweeps missions, independent of bomber escort, penetrating deep into German airspace to attack Luftwaffe fighters on the ground and in the air. The most devastating innovation was the airfield strafe. Mustangs would escort bombers to target, then descend to low altitude on the return flight and attack German airfields, destroying fighters as they landed with fuel tanks nearly empty and ammunition expended. The Luftwaffe faced an impossible dilemma. Engage the bombers and risk being caught by Mustangs with superior range and altitude. Stay on the ground and watch the bombers destroy German industrial capacity unopposed. Take off to engage and risk being strafed during the vulnerable moments of takeoff and landing. There was no good option, because Schmud's wing had eliminated the one advantage Luftwaffe fighters had possessed. They were no longer fighting over their own territory with the security of limited American fighter range. The human cost of this technological shift became visible in the Luftwaffe's casualty statistics. In the first quarter of 1944, German fighter losses averaged 221 aircraft per month, sustainable, barely, given production rates. In the second quarter, with Mustangs operating at full strength, losses jumped to 490 aircraft per month. By July, the Luftwaffe was losing fighters, faster than factories could build them, and more critically, losing experienced pilots faster than training programs could replace them. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, commander of Luftwaffe fighter forces, documented the crisis in increasingly desperate reports to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. The Americans, Galland wrote, had achieved absolute mastery of the air through a combination of numerical superiority and technological advantage. The specific technological advantage he cited, repeatedly, was range. German fighters could no longer choose when and where to engage. The Americans could appear anywhere, at any time, with fuel sufficient for extended combat. The irony, from Galland's perspective, must have been particularly bitter. Germany had pioneered many of the aerodynamic principles that made the Mustang possible. German engineers at the Luftfahrtforschungsanstalt, the Aviation Research Institute, had conducted extensive laminar-flow experiments in the early 1930s. Messerschmitt had considered laminar flow profiles for the Bf-109's wing design in 1934 and rejected them as impractical for mass production. The rejection was reasonable at the time. Maintaining the surface tolerances required for laminar flow in a combat aircraft, subjected to battle damage and field maintenance, seemed impossible. It probably was impossible for the manufacturing technology available in Germany in the mid-1930s. But by 1940, American production techniques specifically, the precision, riveting and surface finishing processes developed for commercial aircraft like the Douglas DC-3 had advanced to the point where laminar flow airfoils could be manufactured consistently at scale. Schmud hadn't invented laminar flow theory. He had bet that American manufacturing could implement it. That bet, dismissed as ridiculous in 1940, determined the outcome of the air war over Europe in 1944. By August of 1944, were conclusive. The 8th Air Force flew 333 heavy bomber missions that year. On missions escorted by Mustangs for the full route, bomber losses averaged 3.2%. On missions where escorts turned back before target, increasingly rare, as more fighter groups transitioned to P-51 seconds, losses averaged 9.7%. The difference represented thousands of lives, hundreds of aircraft, and the practical ability to sustain daylight strategic bombing. German industrial production, despite Albert Speer's impressive reorganization efforts, began collapsing under the sustained precision bombing campaign that Mustang escorts made possible. Ball bearing production, aviation fuel refineries, synthetic rubber plants, locomotive factories, targets deep in German territory that had been effectively invulnerable in 1943, became routine objectives in 1944. The Mustang didn't win the air war alone, but it removed the primary constraint that had limited Allied air power. Edgar Schmud, for his part, never flew a Mustang in combat. He remained in Inglewood, refining the design through successive variants. The P-51D, which appeared in mid-1944, incorporated a bubble canopy for improved visibility, and 6 50-caliber machine guns instead of 4. The P-51H, developed too late to see significant combat in Europe, pushed maximum speed to 487 miles per hour and reduced weight to enhance performance at extreme altitudes. But the fundamental design, the laminar-flow wing, the precisely contoured fuselage, the obsessive attention to surface smoothness remained unchanged from the NA-73X prototype that first flew in October of 1940. Schmood had gotten it right the first time, implementing a theory that everyone told him wouldn't work in practice. The final vindication came in the mission statistics compiled by the 8th Air Force Operational Research Section. Between December of 1943 and May of 1945, P-51 Mustangs flew over 213,000 combat sorties from bases in England, and later, from captured airfields in France and Belgium. They destroyed 4,950 Luftwaffe aircraft in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter type. They provided escort for daylight bombing missions that dropped 732,000 tons of bombs on German industrial and military targets. And they did it with a combat radius that exceeded every German fighter in service by a margin that made Luftwaffe tactical doctrine obsolete. The theoretical advantage that Schmood had calculated in 1940, a 40% reduction in drag through laminar flow, translated directly into the strategic advantage that decided the air war. The mathematics worked, the physics worked, the manufacturing worked, and the operational, concept fighters with sufficient range to escort bombers anywhere in German airspace and loiter over targets with fuel reserves for sustained combat revolutionized strategic bombing doctrine. The cost of proving that theory, however, was measured in the bomber crews who died during the 2 years when Mustangs sat in reconnaissance squadrons, limited by Allison engines that couldn't perform at altitude. 600 men lost at Schweinfurt in October of 1943, hundreds more in raids on Regensburg, Stuttgart, Bremen, targets that required deep penetration without adequate escort. The technology that could have protected them existed, parked in British Army Cooperation Command hangars, flying low-altitude missions while bombers burned over Germany. The delay between identifying the Merlin engine solution in April of 1942 and achieving operational deployment in December of 1943 represented 18 months of bureaucratic inertia, production, delays, and institutional skepticism. 18 months during which the air war over Europe remained a brutal equation of acceptable losses versus strategic objectives. The Mustang's eventual deployment changed that equation decisively, but it couldn't retroactively save the men who died when range limitations left bombers unprotected. By April of 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and the relentless pressure of Allied air superiority had reduced German fighter strength to scattered remnants incapable of coordinated defense. American bombers flew over German cities with minimal opposition, sometimes without fighter escort, because there were no German fighters left to intercept them. The Mustang, designed to solve the escort problem, had solved it so completely that its primary mission became obsolete. The aircraft continued in service long after the war ended. Mustangs flew combat missions in Korea, where their range and ground attack capability remained valuable in a conflict fought over mountainous terrain with limited airfield infrastructure. Air forces around the world operated P-51 seconds into the 1950s until jet fighters finally rendered piston engine designs obsolete. Some remained in civilian hands, racing at air shows or serving as personal aircraft for pilots who appreciated the combination of speed, range, and handling that Schmood's design delivered. But the Mustang's historical significance isn't measured in longevity or versatility. It's measured in the specific problem it solved at the specific moment when that problem threatened to make strategic daylight bombing unsustainable. The bomber offensive against Germany, the campaign that destroyed German industrial capacity, diverted resources to air defense, and demonstrated the vulnerability of the Third Reich to Allied air power, was made possible by a fighter with sufficient range to escort bombers to any target in Europe. And that range was made possible by a wing design that everyone said was ridiculous. Edgar Schmood's decision, in May of 1940, To base North American aviation's first fighter on untested laminar flow theory represents a particular kind of engineering courage. Not the courage to innovate. Innovation is common enough. The courage to commit resources, time, and institutional credibility to a theory that had failed every previous practical application. The courage to look at NACA wind tunnel data and British skepticism and German rejections and conclude that everyone else was wrong, not because the theory was flawed, but because the implementation hadn't been rigorous enough. He was correct. The theory worked. The implementation worked. The manufacturing worked. And the operational results vindicated the ridiculous decision to design a fighter around mathematics that existed only on paper. The price of that vindication was paid by German industrial workers who died under bombs that Mustangs escorted to target, by Luftwaffe pilots who engaged American fighters that could outrange, outfight, and outlast anything Germany could put in the air, by bomber crews who survived missions that would have been suicide 2 years earlier, and by the crews who didn't survive, who died during the interim when the technology existed but operational doctrine hadn't adapted to implement it. The Mustang didn't win the Second World War. No single weapon system determines the outcome of industrial-scale global conflict, but it removed a critical constraint on Allied strategic options, enabling a bombing campaign that accelerated German defeat and reduced the ground war's duration. In the mathematics of total war, where victory is calculated in production capacity and resource attrition, the ability to strike any target in enemy territory with acceptable losses is strategically decisive. And in March of 1944, when Captain Don Gentile escorted bombers to Berlin and returned with fuel to spare, that ability became operational reality. The laminar flow wing, smooth, mathematically precise, dismissed as impractical by every expert who examined it, had changed the air war over Europe, not through radical innovation or unprecedented technology, but through the rigorous application of physics that had been documented in NACA reports since 1935. Schmood's contribution wasn't discovering laminar flow, it was refusing to accept that the gap between theory and practice was unbridgeable. He bridged it. With tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch and manufacturing precision unprecedented in fighter production, he built a wing that worked as the mathematics predicted it would, and that wing carried American fighters to Berlin, to Munich, to every corner of German airspace, with fuel sufficient to fight and return. The ridiculous theory became the fighter that won air superiority over Europe. Sometimes, the mathematics are right and the skeptics are wrong. Sometimes, believing the numbers requires more courage than ignoring them. And sometimes, the difference between theory and practice is simply the willingness to build something precisely enough that the physics can work. Edgar Schmood built it precisely enough. The Mustang proved he was right. And the Luftwaffe paid the price for Germany's decision, 4 years earlier, that laminar flow was too impractical for combat aircraft. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.